So I've accumulated a lot of historical stuff in our dining room I suppose, provide some context for the meals and the life we get to enjoy in the year 2020. Now, we don't really eat in the dining room much because the dining room table is usually full of laundry, mail, and other things, but at least we can walk through this room and into the kitchen and see some things that can help us appreciate our place in the timeline of history. So here it is, the story of human progress told through about 24 objects in our dining room. This is a tetradrachma. It's a coin minted in the Periclean Golden Age of Greece around 425 BC. The Greeks practiced democracy and elevated knowledge and public discourse, and so the head of this coin shows Athena, the goddess of justice and wisdom. The tail of the coin is Athena's owl, and this part is interesting. Notice that the head of the owl has been cut through the middle. The cut was made to make sure the coin was silver through and through, and not a debased version filled with bronze or another less valuable metal. The placement of the cut through the head is suspected to be due to resentment of Greek power, and the cut was made where it was to show defiance to Greek influence. This coin became the first widely accepted international coin, allowing commerce among all the nations in the region, even among enemies of Greece, for over 300 years. It's also one of the first coins, if not the first coin, to have a head and a tail, meaning a side with a human head on one side and an animal depiction on the other. Since the ancient Greeks founded philosophy as a rigorous discipline, even in the Roman Empire that followed afterwards, educated people were expected to speak fluent Greek as well as Latin, so they could read the great Greek philosophers in their original language. And when the Western Roman Empire fell, the Eastern Roman Empire continued, with its people taking up Greek as their primary language. The ancient Greek Empire was followed by the Roman Empire, which saw a continued flourishing of learning, with philosophers continuing to ask important questions about how the world works. Much of this learning was lost during the Dark Ages in Europe, but a book by the ancient Roman philosopher Lucretius, called On the Nature of Things, was rediscovered in a library by a monk in the 1400s. In this book, Lucretius describes a world made up of collections of tiny particles, which we'd later call atoms, and how living things that better adapt to their environments are the most likely to survive into the future. Here's a 1714 publication of the then rediscovered book by Lucretius, which became part of the European Enlightenment and the development of the scientific method that finally continued in earnest the inquiries of the ancient Greeks and Romans. The significance of Lucretius's book, In the Nature of Things, is described in a book called The Swerve. Games have been around for a long time as well, and here's one of a pair of dice from ancient Rome from around 300 AD. It uses the very same dot pattern we use today, not Roman numerals. Now, these early dice were crudely made, and the edges of their sides weren't uniform, so the chances any particular number would come up wasn't precisely equal. But as the production of dice became more uniform during the Middle Ages, when dice-making guilds standardized the size, shape, and weight of dice, people began to finally notice and appreciate the mathematics of precise probability. One of those peoples was Girolamo Cardano, an Italian Renaissance scientist and chronic gambler, who wrote a book around 1564 that first set out the laws of basic probability as we know them today, including how 1 over 6 times 1 over 6 defines the odds of the same number coming up on both sides of a dice when thrown. You can read more about how the history of games spurred knowledge and innovation in Stephen Johnson's excellent book, Wonderland. In November 1693, a fellow named Samuel Pepys, who had been the secretary of the British Admiralty and was later elected as president of the science-oriented Royal Society, wrote to Isaac Newton himself to ask him how to calculate various gambling odds. Newton obliged and showed Samuel Pepys that he was a lousy gambler. The great mathematician and scientist Isaac Newton was the head of the Royal Mint for the last 30 years of his life, where he helped stabilize British finances. But he ended up losing a lot of money by investing in the infamous South Sea Company, a joint stock company established in 1713 that was granted a monopoly on the British slave trade between the islands of the South Seas and South America. There was wild speculation in shares of the company fueled by corrupt trades, and the giant investment bubble collapsed in 1720. Newton himself owned some original South Sea Company stock and reportedly said he, quote, could calculate the motions of the heavenly stars, but not the madness of people, unquote. The South Sea Company survived in various forms for many years afterward, and by 1726 it was involved in Arctic whaling. On July 18th, 1726, a John Boddington distributed around London a bunch of small printed notices. Now this is one of them, an actual original, that reads, quote, lost or mislaid on Saturday last, in or about the South Sea Annuity Office, 2 South Sea September bonds, numbered 4301, 4302, for £100 each. If any person will bring them to the bar at Jonathan's Coffee House, Exchange Alley, or to Mr. William Pepys at the Angel in Lombard Street, he's a banker, or to the bar at Nando's Coffee House, Temple Bar, shall have 5 guineas reward. Now, a guinea back then contained about 1/4 ounce of gold, and no questions asked. And then he also adds NB. Now, that's short for note well in Latin. The payment is stopped. So what he's saying is, hey, I mislaid these things. If you stole them, give them back to me. I'll give you a reward. I won't ask any questions. And by the way, if you try to cash in the bonds, you're not going to get paid because I already went to the office and told them they were stolen. Well, this little leaflet contains a lot of references to some of the most famous coffee shops in and around Exchange Alley in London, where early stock trading first started, including Jonathan's Coffee House, which saw the most intense trading activity, and Nando's, a coffee house on Fleet Street, popular with the legal profession in nearby courts. Interestingly, the William Pepys mentioned in the leaflet was a banker in London, and according to this published Genealogy of British Peerage, he was also a descendant of Samuel Pepys, who I mentioned earlier. William Pepys was the grandson of Samuel Pepys' brother, Richard. A great book covering the early history of stock trading and the South Sea Company is Money for Nothing, The Scientists, Fraudsters, and Corrupt Politicians Who Reinvented Money, Panicked a Nation, and Made the World Rich by Thomas Levinson. Rediscovered Greek and Roman ideas and new ones that arose from the Enlightenment spread around the world during the Age of Navigation, in which European powers used the latest technology to navigate ships across the Atlantic Ocean. Here's a page from the 4th book of a much larger volume called The English Pilot, published around 1750 by the Mountain Page Publishers, which included hundreds of navigational entries to help ship captains find their way around the world. This entry shows the latitudinal and longitudinal coordinates of the Gulf of Mexico and what to look for as your ship approaches. This was the best ship captains could do as far as navigational aids went before our modern global positioning systems were developed. This expansion of international trade around the world spurred the growth of corporations, including England's East India Company, a unique private company authorized by the English government to act as an arm of the government and expanding trade and influence into India. The East India Company helped deliver dyed Indian calico cloth to England, which was adopted by the middle class as well as the aristocracy in a way that helped lead to the blurring of class distinctions and greater democratization. The company also ran a huge trade in pepper, one of the most in-demand commodities of the time, and other spices. The East India Company had its own army, and it minted its own coins, including this one here, a 1773 copper double pice. You can see Bombay and the crown of the King of England, at the time King George III. The same year this coin was minted, a man named Thomas Law started work for the East India Company as a clerk. He later worked his way up to become a revenue collector and judge for the company in India, and still later an influential writer on economics. He was one of the first prominent people to move into a house in Washington, D.C., in the southwest waterfront section in 1796. The house still exists today. Also, the same year this coin was minted, Warren Hastings was appointed Governor General of India, a new position that had been created to improve the administration of British India. Hastings was subject to impeachment proceedings brought by Edmund Burke in the English Parliament. The charges were bogus, and the impeachment inquiry ultimately failed in 1795. Those events and others are described in a book called The Anarchy. That attempt to impeach Hastings was noticed by the founding fathers of the new United States of America and referenced at the Constitutional Convention called to draft the U.S. Constitution, which included its own impeachment provisions. One of those founding fathers was Oliver Ellsworth, a delegate to the Constitutional Convention from Connecticut, and one of only 5 members of the Committee on Detail, which revised drafts of the Constitution for the convention delegates. During the Revolutionary War, Ellsworth was in charge of approving payments to Revolutionary War soldiers from Connecticut, and this is one of the pay authorizations he signed in 1777 for a Captain Jonathan Brewster, who served under Colonel Jedediah Huntington from my hometown of Norwich, Connecticut. Oliver Ellsworth was the principal drafter of Article 3 of the Constitution, the part of the Constitution that established a federal judicial system and the Supreme Court. Ellsworth served as one of the first 2 senators from Connecticut and was the principal drafter of the federal statutes enacted during the first Congress, establishing the federal judiciary, creating federal crimes, and setting the rules for the federal courts. A description of Ellsworth's contributions to the founding of America can be found in this Law Review article. Debates about the extent of the U.S. President's powers and those of Congress began immediately after the ratification of the Constitution. Another great founding father, Alexander Hamilton, served as the first Secretary of the Treasury and was a great supporter of President George Washington, having served as Washington's chief aide during the Revolutionary War. Hamilton went on to engage in a public debate with James Madison in which Hamilton supported a more robust view of presidential power under the Constitution. Here's one of the entries of those debates, written by Hamilton under the pseudonym Pacificus, that appeared in a Boston newspaper in 1793. And below this is the front page of a 1792 issue of the Gazette of the United States, a newspaper that supported Hamilton and other members of the Federalist political party. It contains Hamilton's itemization of the federal debt at the time, which was virtually nothing compared to today's federal debt. Back then, itemizations of the federal debt were front-page news. An envelope signed by Hamilton's political rival James Madison can be found over here. It's a letter from 1822. At the time, former presidents, as was Madison, were allowed to send mail for free by simply signing their name on the envelope. This letter is addressed to a Dr. Cutting, who was Nathaniel Cutting, who then worked with Thomas Law, whom I mentioned earlier, at the Columbian Institute for the Promotion of Arts and Sciences in Washington, D.C. Dr. Cutting was the Institute's secretary, and Thomas Law was one of its vice presidents. Madison's letter that was in this envelope was dated December 7, 1822, and in it Madison states Dr. Cutting had forwarded to him a piece written by Thomas Law at Thomas Law's request. Madison calls Mr. Law, quote, a man of genius, unquote, but he also expresses less confidence than does Mr. Law in the soundness of the government policy of addressing problems by borrowing money. Dr. Cutting himself was an interesting figure. Previously, at the request of President George Washington and then Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, Cutting had served as a diplomat during the 1793-1794 mission to seek an agreement with the Barbary pirates regarding their treatment of American captives on the high seas. The pirates' practice of kidnapping American sailors and ransoming back to America led to President Thomas Jefferson sending the Marines on their first mission to stop these pirates. Now, the Barbary pirates were essentially Muslim warlords operating out of North Africa. Muslim warlords developed the transatlantic slave trade in Africa, where they enslaved Africans and sold them to people from all around the world for hundreds of years. Here we have another Free Frank envelope, this one signed by President Thomas Jefferson's Secretary of the Treasury, Albert Gallatin. The envelope's addressed to a Baltimore customs official, and the letter inside contained instructions on how to enforce various trade laws. Gallatin encouraged President Jefferson to make the Louisiana Purchase, in which Napoleon sold France's territories in America to America. Gallatin arranged the financing for the purchase, the sale of land parcels there, and he helped plan the Lewis and Clark expedition to explore lands west of the Mississippi River. The Louisiana Purchase led to debates about whether the new states in the purchased territory would allow slavery or not, which in turn led to the Civil War. A good book on Hamilton and Gallatin's influence on America's finances early in its history is called The Founders and Finance. But before we get to the Civil War, let's look at some examples of the great leaps in technology that were occurring between the middle of the 1700s and the middle of the 1800s, a period known as the Industrial Revolution. Madison, Ellsworth, and Hamilton would have written under the bright, clear, and relatively odorless and clean burning light of whale oil lamps like this one, made by the Boston and Sandwich Glass Company in New England. But whale oil was later replaced by kerosene, a fossil fuel derived from coal during the Industrial Revolution. The discovery of coal's use as a generator of heat and the use of heat to create power to do mechanical work was one of the most important advances in human history. Now, let's take a great leap back in history to introduce the artifacts to follow. Here's a small part of a fossil from a tree that fell some 350 million years ago in a mudstone bed. You can see the imprint of the tree's bark. This tree fell during the Carboniferous period, a period in Earth's history marked by huge forests that absorbed large amounts of sunlight, capturing the sun's energy and burying it under immense pressure, concentrating that energy in the form of coal. The remains of these trees and other fossil fuels became the coal deposits of North America and England. This fossil, in fact, was unearthed 20 years ago when coal was being mined in West Yorkshire, England. Well, this tree and others helped produce the coal that created the demand for the steam engine, which was originally developed to use the coal in England to turn heat into work done by a machine that helped dig ever deeper coal mines. And here we have an engraving from the first edition Cyclopedia by Abraham Rees, published in Philadelphia around 1810, which shows how the steam engine invented by James Watt operated at the Chelsea Waterworks. There's a great series of lectures on the Industrial Revolution in the Great Courses series here. So this tree fueled the steam engine and the other machines of the Industrial Revolution that began in England and later spread around the world, leading to the creation of industries that resulted in the manufacture of all sorts of fantastic things that have increased human well-being in all the many ways we've seen ever since. The companies that launched the Industrial Revolution weren't just fueled by heat and steam, they were fueled by capital, money invested by other people who shared the hope the company would be successful in return for part of the profits. But many companies didn't succeed and went out of business, causing losses for investors in those companies. If investors couldn't limit their risk of loss, they'd be reluctant to invest in any companies because they wouldn't want to risk losing all of their own money. But something came along that allowed investors to limit their risk of loss. That something was insurance, a form of risk spreading in which an entrepreneur and others could pay a relatively small premium for a big sense of security, knowing their monthly premium payments would pay for coverage of their losses in the event their company failed. Here's an insurance table from 1844, printed by the North British Insurance Company, showing how much you would have to pay in return for a certain amount of insurance coverage. These tables were based on the laws of probability first set out by Girolamo Cardano, who was mentioned before, the Renaissance scientist and gambler who studied rolls of the dice, and by Edmund Halley, who discovered Halley's Comet, but also converted probabilities into tables in 1693, showing the odds of mortality during certain age ranges. Getting probabilities of loss as accurate as possible was essential to workable insurance, because if premiums aren't matched to probabilities accurately, the insurance company will go bankrupt. The machines fueled by coal and steam during the Industrial Revolution powered assembly lines that created uniform, interchangeable parts that put high technology in the hands of ordinary people for the first time in human history. Now, the concepts of interchangeable parts in mass production go way back. Take, for example, this piece from the Qin Dynasty in China, which goes back to around 200 BC, over 2,000 years ago. This is the trigger mechanism for a crossbow. The massive armies of the Chinese Empire used these mass-produced trigger mechanisms to operate crossbows that held off invaders for centuries. And these crossbow parts were uniform and interchangeable, so defective trigger mechanisms could be swapped out quickly on the battlefield for new ones, preventing Chinese armies from being overwhelmed. But China began a policy of isolationism around the 13th century. They purposely cut themselves off from the rest of the world. And this was a policy that lasted into the 20th century. Under this policy, China also cut itself off from the technological innovations that improved on technologies developed around the world. That wasn't the case in the West, including England and America, which brings us to Samuel Colt and his invention of the Colt revolver. The Colt revolver came to be exhibited and sold worldwide, and Colt used the techniques of uniform, interchangeable parts and assembly lines to produce a gun with a revolving reloader that allowed many shots before reloading. This is the hammer mechanism from a model 1851 Colt Navy revolver. It was the preferred gun of Wild Bill Hickok, Buffalo Bill Cody, and Doc Holliday. Endorsed by the Texas Rangers, an American military unit, the Colt revolver became essential for pioneer families who needed a rapid-fire weapon to protect themselves from assaults by larger numbers of potential attackers as they traveled west to settle in the new states and territories of America. A great book on Samuel Colt is Revolver, Sam Colt and the Six-Shooter That Changed America. Colt successfully defended his patent on the revolver from infringement by competing gunmaker Smith & Wesson, and one of Colt's attorneys arguing his case was George Ticknor Curtis, a prominent attorney. Curtis was a historian as well, and this is an original edition of his biography of Daniel Webster, who was an influential member of Congress who was engaged in some of the most important debates preceding the Civil War. George Ticknor Curtis went on to represent Dred Scott in the Supreme Court. Dred Scott was a slave who sued for his freedom in court because he lived in a free state that prohibited slavery under the Missouri Compromise. But the Supreme Court infamously ruled against Scott, declaring he was property that couldn't have the rights of a citizen. That terrible decision helped lead to the Civil War. Opening up the West to settlement under the protection of the Colt revolver also contributed to more disputes about which states should allow slavery and which shouldn't. And before America could enjoy more of the fruits of the Industrial Revolution, it would have to endure a civil war that cost the lives of over 500,000 Americans. Over here is a Union rifle used in the Civil War. It's a Union musket stamped with a U.S. for United States. It was manufactured in 1863 by Alfred Jenkson's son at the Bridesburg Machine Works in Bridesburg, Pennsylvania, for the Union Army. And here's what's called a William Ellery pocket watch. In the 1850s, watchmakers at what would become the American Watch Company of Waltham, Massachusetts, developed the world's first machine-made watches. They completely redesigned the watch so that its parts could be assembled from interchangeable parts made on specialized machines invented just for that purpose. You can see some of the small and intricate parts of the watch through the back here. During the Civil War, Waltham's watch factory designed and mass-produced this low-cost watch called the William Ellery model. Previously, pocket watches were so expensive only the wealthy could afford them, but this William Ellery watch sold for an astonishingly low $13, and they became extremely popular with Union soldiers. The story of this and other inventions, including others we'll see later, is told wonderfully by Steven Johnson in his book and accompanying television series, How We Got to Now. Here's an 1812 edition of William Scott's Lessons in Elocution, a popular instructional reader containing examples of great writing and great speeches. This is the very same book that so influenced Abraham Lincoln in his youth and throughout his life. As Michael Gerhard writes in his book, Lincoln's Mentors, The Education of a Leader, besides the poems he encountered in the readers he had at school, Lincoln would have come across poetry in William Scott's Lessons in Elocution, another of the books that his stepmother had brought into their home. Around 1825, Lincoln began to read the Scott collection closely, which included Shakespeare, a writer who, along with Robert Burns, Lincoln quoted frequently throughout his life. The Union won the Civil War under the leadership of Abraham Lincoln. This is a letter written by the man who had moved the unanimous nomination of Abraham Lincoln for president at the 1860 Republican National Convention. His name was William Evarts. He served as U.S. Secretary of State under Presidents Hayes and Garfield, U.S. Attorney General under President Johnson, and U.S. Senator from New York. He was renowned for his skills as a litigator and was involved in some of the most important legal cases of his day. Evarts was lead attorney for the federal government in the treason prosecution of former Confederacy President Jefferson Davis, the grand jury indictment for which was approved by the first racially integrated federal grand jury in American history, including blacks who were active participants in Republican politics. Evarts was also chief counsel for President Johnson during his impeachment trial, which ended in Johnson's acquittal. Evarts was the first president of the New York City Bar Association, a position he held when he wrote this letter. Evarts later became a senator from New York and was the chief sponsor of the Judiciary Act of 1891, also known as the Evarts Act, which created the United States Courts of Appeal, completing the modern structure of the federal judiciary following the lead of Oliver Ellsworth, who was mentioned earlier. Evarts led the American fundraising effort for the pedestal for the Statue of Liberty. He gave a speech immediately preceding the unveiling of the statue on October 28, 1886. This letter, penned by Evarts, is addressed to George William Childs, the publisher of the Philadelphia Public Ledger newspaper. The letter states, "My dear sir, I regret that my absence at Washington ever since your letter of the 7th has prevented its coming into my hands until this morning. Mrs. Evarts and myself are expecting to come to Philadelphia for the meeting of the Peabody trustees, and it will give me great pleasure to accept your invitation to dinner for Wednesday. Yours very truly, William M. Evarts." The referenced Peabody trustees refers to the trustees of the Peabody Education Fund, established by George Peabody, widely regarded as the founder of modern philanthropy. The Peabody Education Fund funded education in the poorest areas of the United States. Peabody also funded, among other things, the Yale Peabody Museum of Natural History and the Harvard Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology. Now, next we have an eyeglass lens from a pair of glasses produced at the American Optical Company in the early 1900s. The rim of the frames was stamped with AOC 072, and the lens is marked with AO for American Optical. The company was located in Southbridge, Massachusetts, and was a major producer of standardized glasses. Interestingly, eyeglasses only became really important after the printing press was invented, after which the printed word on the page gave people something small they wanted to look at. Before that, the people didn't think they had much of a need to see small things more clearly. Lenses were, of course, also crucial in the manufacture of telescopes, which exposed the workings of physics on a universal scale, and microscopes, which exposed the workings of things on a microscopic scale, including the role of microbes in the spread of disease. Regarding the spread of disease, in the late 1800s, it was discovered that chlorine could purify water sources in public swimming pools, but it took the wife of a bleach company investor, Annie Murray, to make disinfectants popular for use in people's own homes. Murray came up with the idea of marketing chlorine cleaning products to individual households, and Clorox became sold in these small amber glass bottles to help keep kitchens in the home disease-free, marking a revolution in cleanliness we all appreciate today. The next piece of glass here is a vacuum tube, RCA's Cunningham Type 3944 radio vacuum tube. These devices became a key component of electronic circuits for the first half of the 20th century. They were crucial to the development of radio, television, radar, sound recordings and reproduction, long-distance telephone networks, and analog and early digital computers. They operate by using heat to amplify signals so they can be passed along more easily. They were later replaced by transistors. Here we have a device called a telegraph sounder. It included the first practical application of the electromagnet. When a telegraph message comes in from the electrical wire attached to it, the moving electricity creates a magnetic field that pulls a metal lever down to meet two magnets on the device, and the sounder produced an audible clicking sound representing the short and long key presses, the dots and dashes, which are used to represent text characters in Morse code. A telegraph operator would translate the sounds into characters representing the telegraph message. This is a Western Union Telegraph Company 1B local sounder, 400 or 100 ohms, by J.H. Bunnell, local. The bottom corner of the metal base is stamped with the words Patent, May 7th, 1895. This process of using on or off electrical signals to relay communication was dramatically expanded on by Claude Shannon, an American mathematician, electrical engineer, inventor, and cryptographer who is credited with founding the field of information theory. These are two books from Shannon's own library, which were auctioned off by Kunzer Books on behalf of his estate. The first book is The Chess Reader, and it's signed Claude Shannon on the inside cover, as it was part of his own library. Claude Shannon did research on chess and wrote on programming a computer to play chess in an article titled Programming a Computer for Playing Chess. And here's another book from Shannon's library called Tables, Functions, Formula, Curves. Shannon figured out how to use simple on and off electrical switches and combinations that could store and relay information. And today, millions of such switches are on all small computer chips that make everything from the internet to video games possible. A great book on the history of electronic communication from Morse code to the computers of today is James Glick's book called The Information. Regarding video games, here's an original Rolling Stone magazine issue dated December 7th, 1972, featuring a famous article about the first major video game tournament with players competing for the high score in an early video game called Space Wars. This article predicted the future immense popularity of video games. Here to represent Flight is a letter from Eddie Rickenbacker, thanking an Ohio public school administrator for recognizing his contributions to aviation. Rickenbacker was an American fighter ace in World War I and a Medal of Honor recipient. With 26 aerial victories, he was the United States' most successful fighting ace in World War I. He was also a race car driver, car designer, a military consultant, and a pioneer in air transportation, particularly as the longtime head of Eastern Airlines. Eastern Airlines ran much more frugally and efficiently than any other airline. One airline executive said, quote, "Eastern's costs were simply on a different plateau," unquote, and much lower than those of other carriers. But at the time, under heavy federal regulation, price cutting was virtually outlawed, and Eastern then couldn't do what Walmart does today, namely transform savings into lower prices and more customers. But Rickenbacker tried admirably, refusing to accept federal taxpayer money. And here's the most modern thing in the room and appropriate for the dining room, a Thermo King temperature gauge from its early years in the 1940s. Thermo King Corporation makes transport temperature control systems for trucks, trailers, shipboard containers, and railway cars. The company pioneered the refrigerated transport of food, allowing people to eat better and with more variety than ever before, regardless of season, by creating a farm-to-fork cold chain that allowed foods to remain good to eat after being transported long distances. The company also invented the first portable refrigerators that were used to feed troops stationed overseas in World War II. Thermo King's products made possible large supermarkets in the modern restaurant industry. The history of the next three items are well described in Charles Fishman's book, One Giant Leap, which describes the technology that went into the first manned mission to the moon. A fellow named Charles Doc Draper worked at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and during World War II, he and his colleagues worked on the problem of providing accurate gun sights to protect Allied warships from incoming enemy aircraft. As described in the book One Giant Leap, quote, "Aiming an anti-aircraft gun at an attacking airplane was a complicated problem. The ship it was mounted on was moving, and also crashing through waves. The gun doing the shooting was vibrating furiously, and the attacking airplane was moving. The anti-aircraft guns the British and Americans used at the start of the war proved incapable of protecting their ships because gunners couldn't get them aimed fast enough. Draper's team at MIT, working with Sperry Gyroscope, developed a legendary piece of equipment called the Mark 14 gun sight, which took all the motions into account and automatically smoothed and adjusted the gun. So a gunner sighting incoming aircraft through the Mark 14 was in fact aiming where the plane would be seconds later when the bullets arrived." This is an actual manual for soldiers on how to operate the Mark 14 gun sight. Reading from the book One Giant Leap again, quote, "The Mark 14, said one World War II U.S. Navy gunnery officer, did 4 hours of differential calculus in a split second. The gyroscopic gun sight, which was kept secret until just before the war ended, was so innovative and so successful that Sperry made 100,000 of them, which were widely installed on U.S. and British Navy warships and were credited with saving ships and thousands of lives from attacking German and Japanese aircraft. The key elements in the Mark 14 were gyroscopes, sophisticated spinning devices that looked like a child's top. One of the people Draper worked with at Sperry Gyroscope during World War II was Jim Webb, the future head of NASA, who was young but already a senior executive at Sperry. The culture at the MIT Instrumentation Lab was a pure Draper creation, a setting for training graduate students and future engineers, mixing math and physics along with advanced engineering and manufacturing to create new tools that applied advanced science to solving hard problems with real technology. That's what the Mark 14 gun sight had been. That's why Draper had a pilot's license and a plane, so he could go up in the air and see and feel the problems of flight firsthand. Draper and his students and colleagues were working on the idea of what Draper called, quote, navigation inside a box, unquote. That was inertial navigation. The idea, the theory, had been around for a couple decades. The German V-2 rockets had used gyroscopes to help with their guidance, and the creator of those V-2 rockets, Wernher von Braun, had come to the U.S. with his team after World War II. But it was Draper and his students and colleagues who figured out how to design and build the sophisticated technology and knit it all together to make inertial navigation a reality. That became Draper's focus after World War II. And here's a 1971 instruction manual study guide for how to operate the inertial navigation system on a DC-8 plane run by the Flying Tiger fleet. The Flying Tigers were the first scheduled cargo airline in the United States and a major military charter operator during the Cold War era for both cargo and personnel. The airline was bought by Federal Express in 1988 and used to ship packages everywhere. Reading again from the book One Giant Leap, quote, "For Charles Draper, the science was clear. Inertial navigation would work. The equations proved it. What stood in the way was the quality and precision of the instruments necessary to do the measurements, the gyroscopes themselves. It was the perfect example of how the application of advanced science often required pushing forward the state-of-the-art of manufacturing as well." Dissatisfied with the quality of the workmanship he could get, he recruited watchmakers from Waltham Watch. That's the same watch company that made the William Ellery watch discussed earlier. Those people were skilled at precision work with tiny components. Draper imposed an early form of clean room techniques in the areas where the gyroscopes were made. Workers wearing shoe covers and head covers, women forbidden to wear makeup while assembling the gyroscopes, because of the dawning realization that something as small as a hair or a spot of dirt or makeup could ruin the functioning of the sealed gyroscopes, which spun at 12,000 RPM. It was the result of that work that became the huge inertial measurement unit installed in the back of MIT's B-29 bomber for a secret flight in 1953. The Superfortress took off at 8:25 a.m. on Sunday, February 8, 1953, and flew for 13 hours and 6 minutes, 2,590 miles, across the width of the country, on its own, without any assistance from Draper's chief pilot, Charles "Chip" Collins, until it was time to land at Los Angeles International Airport. Remarkably, when the plane and the new inertial navigation system encountered the 100-mile-per-hour jet stream passing over Lake Mead in Nevada, it adjusted to compensate in a series of maneuvers that the crew found baffling. The jet stream was little understood at the time, but that turned out to be just right. After more than 13 hours in flight, the plane was just 10 miles off course as it approached LAX, 10 miles out of 2,590 flown. The B-29 flight was so significant a milestone in advanced navigation that when the U.S. government finally allowed Draper to talk about it in April 1957, that one 4-year-old airplane flight made front-page news across the nation. "Devices guide planes across U.S. without help of outside objects," was the New York Times headline. The Washington Post was more expansive. "New jamming-proof gyropilot guides any kind of aircraft anywhere on Earth." Draper himself described inertial navigation for the ordinary public by way of metaphor. Quote, "An inertial system does for geometry what a watch does for time," unquote. The inertial navigation system, of course, was essential to the first manned mission to the moon, guiding the lunar lander down to its proper spot for landing. Now here are 3 Fairchild UL-923 micrologic integrated circuits. These were integral to NASA's project of manned missions to the moon as well. If you could strip off the top of these integrated circuits, here's what you'd see. Now let's read again from Charles Fishman's book, One Giant Leap. Quote, "Although MIT could ultimately buy 1 million integrated circuit chips for Apollo, an extraordinary volume in the 1960s, that was still a tiny amount. MIT would build only about 70 computers altogether, and it would build only 20 that would fly with astronauts in space. The million chips were enough for roughly 200 computers. That's why the instrumentation lab was simultaneously insistent on a whole new standard of quality and also worried about who would supply the chips. The instrumentation lab picked Fairchild. That way, one company got all the business. They picked a single chip from Fairchild for simplicity of design and manufacturing in the Apollo computer, and again to give Fairchild maximum output of a single product. They specified that the same chip had to be used in the ground support and testing equipment at MIT and NASA facilities. Even so, Fairchild actually dropped the particular chip MIT was using, the MicroLogic, right in the middle of the race to the moon because it was becoming outdated. But it was picked up and sustained by Philco Corporation until the Apollo computers were finished. And now to round out our tour is this limited edition ticket to the House Judiciary Committee hearing room for the day the U.S. House of Representatives had a hearing on constitutional impeachment standards during the proceedings of the impeachment of President Donald Trump. Like the failed 1795 English impeachment of the Governor-General of India, Warren Hastings, whom we heard about earlier, this impeachment deserved to fail as well. So that brings us to the end of our dining room history tour. As you can see, the story behind lots of these small things can add up to a pretty grand narrative of human history. And there's always more to add. Hope you enjoyed the tour.